Okay, so Sahar has a really fascinating background. You're probably intrigued by her name and who she is, and I'm sure she'll be telling you a little bit about herself. But she's just one of these women of the world in terms of having a little bit of experience and background of many different cultures. She's fluent, just to give you an example, she's fluent in English, French, Arabic, several different dialects, Spanish, and conversant in Hebrew as well. And she's lived in 7 different countries. She traveled every 4 years because her dad, was it your dad? Was a diplomat, so she traveled every 4 years and lived in different countries. And she's been involved with a lot of different training, global leadership, diversity, cross-cultural, and a lot of other things. She has a degree from Cairo University in medicine, double bachelor's medicine and surgery with a minor in psychiatry. So she has that whole healthcare connection that we like to hear about with, for health and human services. And some examples of some of the things that she does as part of her profession. Not too long ago, she published a white paper about cross-cultural competence and how it affects the patient's experience for the Burroughs Institute. And not too long ago, she was the keynote speaker at a conference in Winnipeg, Canada about diversity in the healthcare sector. So I know you're going to enjoy the class today. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Well, good afternoon. Like Karen said, my name is Sahar Andrade. Obviously, I don't need a microphone. I have good vocal cords. And I promise I'm going to make it as fun as possible today. So when few of you started coming in, I asked them what they're looking for. So I heard 3 things already. What's in the name, the language, and machismo. Is there anything else that you came for to learn about today, besides these points? Basically, why did you come to the class today? I want to make sure that we are going to touch every single point why you come in for the class today. And by the way, this is an interactive class. I mean, though I'm going to be saying a lot of information or giving you a lot of information, I always like to interact with whoever is in this session because I think it makes it a little bit more fun. And I don't like to talk all the time, so you give me some rest. So if you tell me why you're here today, that will help at least achieving the goals of why you are here today. Instead of like you wanted to hear something in specific, and by the end of the class, oh, we didn't touch that. So let's kind of think why you're here today so we can touch on all these points.
I was hoping to learn about how machismo and marianismo
Okay.
And family dynamic in Hispanic cultures, how can we best work with that in order to establish rapport and ongoing care with the families?
Absolutely. Actually, this is a big thing that we're going to be talking about today, which is it's the familismo, which is the family in the Spanish culture or the Hispanic culture, if I properly. Okay, what else?
With regards to from an agency perspective, some people are of the opinion that anybody can serve the Latino community as long as you have an interpreter and then you're nice to the people. Is that the best way to deal with, or to handle the Latinos, or serve them, or actually any group. Any group, that you go get an interpreter, especially like with child welfare services. You're getting into a lot of deep conversations, and sometimes it's just not, right when you're talking about very sensitive things, and you have an interpreter there. It would be better to have, somebody who speaks Spanish and understands the culture. But sometimes the way things are, you may not have a Spanish-speaking person, and so you have to have an interpreter.
We're going to go through that. Actually, it's part of the presentation today. Anything else? Yes.
I'd love to learn some more about some of the traditional healers within, the
Curandismo
Curandismo and
sure.
stuff like that.
Okay. Anything else? Okay. Well, like Karen said, I was born in Egypt, and I'm half Turkish, half Egyptian. My husband is Hispanic, and we have been married for 13 years now. And when I was telling him a little bit about what I'm doing today, about the curanderos, which are the traditional healers, and he got very surprised. And he told me, we have never used that before. though I know a lot of people that have used that before. So that tells you a little bit how the different generations, when they come and they are more acculturated with whatever is going on in the United States, they kind of step back from the traditions or step back from the roots of the culture that they come from. Like I'm here, I came here to the United States by myself in the late 80s as a student, and I don't really relate that much anymore to Egypt. So it's just like, even when I talk to my siblings, I feel like they are from a totally different world than I am. Just though I was born there and I was raised everywhere, but at least we don't even think about the same level anymore. So let's go before we. Today we're going to be talking about the demographics, about the concept of what cultural competence is, and I know that a lot of you have been in diversity and cultural competence classes before, so I'm not going to dwell over the general definitions. I have them in your book, but I'm not really going to lose time about that. I'm not going to bore you. So identify the awareness of what is the communication and relationship styles. Also important to know your own cultural values and how they affect your view to other cultures. The barriers, manage and bridge discrepancies, why involve a family or even a community when you are dealing with a patient, and some solutions. Hola. So let's start with really quick what diversity is. And diversity, people have the tendency to look at the differences rather than looking at the similarities. And actually, diversity is basically about the differences and the similarities that we have as human beings. You know, what diversity means is what are the unique characters that makes each one of us. And that's what makes us diverse. So and that has nothing to do with Title VII. That has nothing to do with protected classes. Protected classes is something that the law protect them because they are considered minorities. And minorities have, some of them are people of color or women, and that is not what we're talking about today. Diversity is not the protected classes. Diversity is who we are as people and how diverse we are. So if you want to remember the basics of the diversity, the word regards comes into action here. So regards is basically, it's the race, the ethnicity, gender, age, religion, disability or disabilities. And disabilities, we need to remember that disabilities can be visible or invisible, because a lot of mental disabilities are invisible, and we have a growing rate of people that are suffering from internal disabilities that people do not really how to deal with them, and actually it can kind of aggravate what they're going through rather than help them. Sexual orientation, and a lot more. The diversity includes the socioeconomic effects, the education, the job titles, blue collar, white collar, where they have been educated. Are they from the East Coast? Are they from the West Coast? Where they grew up? And also it has to do with diversity of thoughts. Even the diversity of thoughts has to do a lot with diversity that we have. So the word diversity is a lot broader than what people like to box it sometimes in what it means or who does it affect. The business case for diversity is that we are seeing a lot, the workforce is changing, especially the minorities are more or less increasing. Very soon, the minorities are going to be majority, especially around 2050. In the United States, every year there is 1 million legal immigrants that come to this country. Legal immigrants that come to this country. And these people come in different ages and different generations, and most of them come and keep their own cultures. So they keep their habits, their customs, their language, and it's very hard for them to adapt to the new system where they come in. And that depends a lot about how they consider family, where they came from, and how big is their community in here. And so we have Little Havana, for example, in Florida. We have Little Tokyo in Los Angeles, Chinatown. We have even, there is, around Hollywood, there is an Armenian city now, you know, that is there. So it's just like Westwood is basically Persian town. So every single area now is named after an ethnicity. Not necessarily a race, but an ethnicity and where they came from. So the business case is the immigrants, and then also now, for the first time in the United States, we have 4 generations. We have the conservatives, the baby boomers, the Gen X, and the Gen Y. And even Gen Y, usually is considered 2 generations, the pre and post 9/11. So that's more diverse than ever, that we have culture differences between every single group. And culture is not only where you came from or your ethnicity. Culture is everything you do. Culture is the lens that we see the world through. So every single group of age, ethnicity, race, education have their own culture. Like, for example, the doctors will have a certain culture, they will speak in a certain language that will basically be jargon to someone else. So if a doctor goes to a patient and tells them, you have nephritis that causes hypertension, the vasodilatation and the vasoconstriction, and all that, it will never make any sense to the patient. But it makes perfect sense for the people that are in the medical field. So that's what culture is more or less is. Then we have the women are 60% of the bachelor's and master's now are earned by women. And women are getting to be in more executive positions, so that's changing totally the culture of leadership in the workplace or wherever we go these days. And then we have, because of the civil laws, now the sexual orientation is adding a new dimension to our life. And that's why it's important now, when we ask someone about their partner, we ask about your partner or your significant other, rather than asking about spouse. So to be respectful of all the sexual orientations. That being said, these are a few definitions, and I'm not going to go through them because they're in your book and I don't want to really lose time on it. But I want you to know that cultural blindness, you hear a lot of people that say, I don't see any color. I don't see any difference of color. And for me, this is one of the most prejudiced expressions that you can ever hear. When you don't see any color, that means that you are not acknowledging that there are differences. And there are differences that we need to acknowledge and deal with. But when you say I'm a color blind, that means that you don't see any difference. And actually, it doesn't logically make sense. So a bias is the lens that we see the world. Sometimes we have our own preconceived ideas, and no matter how open-minded we are, we still have personal bias. And the first step in cultural sensitivity and cultural competence is to know exactly what are our own bias and our own prejudice. No matter how open-minded we are, we still have this bias and prejudice. And it comes from what we call first impressions. Who believes in first impressions? You know that we stopped having first impressions since we were 12? Everything we react to that we call first impression is a gut feeling that is triggered by a memory or a meaning that we have in our mind. So it could be someone that we saw on TV, or someone that we saw on the street that did something wrong, or a story that we heard from a neighbor, or a story that we heard from a family. But first impression really, we have seen mostly everything by the age of 12 to 15 max. And everything is just triggered by a memory that we see after that. Then we have the stereotype, cultural competence. Ethnocentricity is when you believe that your culture is the best culture. It's my way or the highway. That everybody is inferior than your culture. That your culture is the only right one, and everybody has to assimilate into whatever you are as a culture. So culture is acquired, and it's a system of shared assumptions that we grow. So our first contact with culture is who? Our parents. And then the schools, the religious institutions that we go to, no matter if they are churches, if they are temples, if they are mosques, no matter what they are, this is our second or third part of culture competence. And it's transmitted through generations, but each one of us is adaptable to the medium we are in. So it's very important that when we discuss culture of a certain group, and we're going to use a lot of generalizations today. The generalizations that I'm going to use are only for startup points. It's not stereotypings. And I'm very careful to tell you, I have to tell you this, that not whatever we're going to discuss as Hispanics or Latinos, that doesn't mean that every single Hispanic person is like that. And it doesn't mean that every single Latino person is like that. It's a starting point that we can know, because even within groups, there are individuality. where every single one of them might have a different culture. And depending how long they have been in the United States, depending which generation they are in. Like I just told you, my husband, because he's a fifth generation, he's totally different than maybe his grandparents or his great-grandparents. So it's different how long they have been here, who they have been around. He has been to schools, like not only around Hispanics, he grew up with different ethnicities, so his mind is totally different than the typical Hispanic or Latino culture. There are 4 cultural characteristics in any culture there is. Any culture there is, there are 4 of them. Individual versus collective, high power distance versus low power distance, and high uncertainty to low uncertainty, masculinity through femininity. What does that mean? The first part, which is individualism versus collectivism. Individualistic people are like here in the United States, we are very proud of our achievements. So as an individual, we go for goals, we achieve the goals, and we are very proud of them. And also we go by ourselves, like we depend on ourselves more or less. Collective cultures like the Hispanic culture or the Latino culture, they are basically family-centered. So they are collective. There is no competitiveness between them. And some people look at them sometimes and they say, oh, they are too passive. Actually, they're not too passive. They just grow up in a culture that it belongs more to a collective idea or a collective culture. And that's why they work in groups, they live in families, like we're going to see in a little bit. Collective cultures also, like the Asian cultures are collective, the Middle Eastern cultures. Like for example, the Middle Easterns, we hear a lot of names that have Abu in it or Ibn in it. Abu means the father, Ibn means the son. So they are related, they keep continuing the family with their names, by even their last names, they keep continuing the family traditions. That's what collective is. And when they describe themselves in a collective culture, they don't tell you who they are, what are their degrees, where they work, but they actually tell you who is their father, who's their mother, who's their cousins, you know, who are their sisters and brothers. So it's about a group, a collective group. They don't act as individual people. The high power distance versus low power distance, it means authority, where they see people have to be in classes. So the higher people, social classes, or the authority, and by the way, the people that apply the high power distance, like the Hispanics or the Latinos, they consider the medical professionals are high authority. So they deal with you already with that level of respect and that level of acknowledgement. Versus here in the United States, we have a very low power distance. Like our boss, we can call them by the first name. We are all in this together. We don't see that big gap in power. And that will affect totally the culture. We're going to see how when we're going to go through it. Uncertainty avoidance, meaning like they don't like to have anything uncertain. But the Hispanic or the Latino culture has a lot of uncertainty because they believe, they are very religious, they believe in God, so everything is in God's hand. They believe that they have no power over fate. So uncertainty, they kind of like, they have a lot of uncertainty that's happening and they accept it. Because everything is between God. God will do. God will give, God will take, God will reward you for whatever it is. So it's all about God, all about religion. Masculinity versus femininity, it's not about gender, it's not about being a female or a male. Masculinity is a culture that basically depends on your achievements and your rewards and how you work hard for it. Everything is about what you do as a person. So it's basically in the United States here, even in Hispanics, it's about how more or less your achievement as a goal. But in certain cultures, like in Amsterdam, like Sweden, they call feminine cultures because it's all about nurturing relationships. It's all about everybody being equal. It's all about peaceful. So we have that in Switzerland and more or less in the Swedish area of Europe. When the Titanic sank, what made the Titanic sink? Iceberg. And what was the most dangerous part of that iceberg? Exactly. That's how culture is. The biggest part of the iceberg of culture is under the surface that you don't see. And that's why culture is very important. Because almost 9/10 of the culture is under the surface, beneath the surface, and you do not see it. So on the surface, what would you see on the surface of a culture?
Color, yeah.
Color,
Language.
language, dressing, music, food, customs. But under that surface, you will have the traditions, the physical ability, the life experiences, the way they deal with pain, the sexual orientation, the concept of past and future, how they relate to nature, because all that are facts and are actually important factors in how every single culture deals with each other and with other cultures from different parts of the world. So the Hispanic population, now let's talk about the Hispanic population. I mean, we talked about general things and now we're going through Hispanic population. So in the 2010 census, the percentage of Hispanic backgrounds were 63% were Mexican, 9.2% of Puerto Rican background. Can you see Anna from here?
Oh, yeah.
3.5% Cubans, 3.3% Salvadorians, and 2.8% Dominicans. And the rest was remainder of Central and South American Hispanic/Latino origin. And we're going to speak in a little bit what's the difference between Hispanic and Latinos. Because a lot of people are confused, and believe it or not, some of the Hispanics and Latinos, when you ask them what's the difference, it will take them a few minutes to answer that question, and they don't necessarily answer it the right way. So it just because they are, you can use Hispanic or you can use Latino. It's not, none of them is wrong, but it depends really, and we're going to talk about that, about how your patient or the person that you're dealing with wants to be called. And we're going to know what's the difference between them. And this is the source of the percentages that I got, the census of 2010. So in 2011, 52 million Hispanics were 16.7% of the total population. In 2050, they believe that between every 3 Americans, there will be 1 Hispanic. So they're going to be 30% of the population, and that's why they're becoming a huge power, not only as part of the US population, but also when you talk about the buying power, when you talk about political power, voting power. So they are becoming a force that has to be reckoned with, actually. 1.3 Hispanics were added between July of 2010 and July of 2011 in 1 year. In 1 year, 1.3 million Hispanics were added to the US population. There are 14 million, almost and a half, Hispanics/Latinos that live in California. 4 million and a quarter in Florida, 9 million and a half in Texas, and 3 million and a half in New York. It's projected, like I said, it's going to be 132 million by 2015. That will make them 30% of the population. In order for us to understand the different cultures of Hispanic, because Hispanics and Latinos have a lot of cultures together. They come from 26 countries. The origins of Latinos or Hispanics are Europeans, Africans, Middle Eastern, indigenous. So all these cultures got mixed together depending on the geography and how and why they came to the United States. So if we start understanding their history, I always believe, and I'm sure that you are in the medical field, you always know that if you treat the root, the symptoms will go away. But if you treat the symptoms, the roots will always be there, and the symptoms and signs can come back if you don't treat them properly. So if you know the roots, you can have some answers and some explanations to why things are happening. So the first thing about the Mexicans, Mexico and Texas used to be part of the United States. I'm sorry, California and Texas used to be part of Mexico. I'm sorry, I got that wrong. And there was the US-Mexican War in 1848, there was a treaty called Guadalupe Hidalgo, where they actually, the United States took California and Texas. So they inherited already Mexicans without them being immigrated. These were actually the land, and this is where they stayed, and they regained citizenship of the United States. So, but they're actually from Mexico, but the United States gained that land after the Hidalgo-Guadalupe Treaty. And then in 1910, since 1848, Mexicans really did not immigrate that much to the United States. Till 1910, where the Mexican Revolution happened, and the economic environment was really bad, so they started immigrating to the United States. In 1930, when the Great Depression hit, the United States started deporting the Mexicans, including their children that were American citizens, back to Mexico. But when the war came, the Great War came, they needed a lot of people to work, especially in the field. So the United States created the Bracero program. And Bracero means strong arm. And these are basically more people that came to work in the farms. And this, if you really ask a lot of Mexicans here, how come they're United citizens, they will trace it back to the Bracero programs. I personally know a lot of people that they trace back their coming to the United States either because they were part of California or Texas, or their grandparents came as part of the Bracero program. And they worked in the farms. And then came in around the 60s, started what we call the Chicano movement. And the Chicano movement is very specific to the western part. So you will see it only in California, you will see it in Nevada, you will see it in Arizona, and parts of Colorado. The Chicano movement is basically, it was done because of the civil rights. And one of the biggest people that were very well known in the Chicano movement was Cesar Chavez. Cesar Chavez created the United Farm Workers. He basically started fighting for the rights of the Mexicans, and the Mexicans, American, to have civil rights. So you will hear the word, beside Hispanic and Latino, you will hear the word Chicano and Chicana. Chicano and Chicana, you will hear it only about Mexican Americans that are in California or in Arizona, not in other parts of the United States. It's just for the western part, because of Cesar Chavez. Then came the American GI forms, and a lot of people do not know the story of Dr. Garcia. Dr. Garcia was one that worked along with Dr. Martin Luther King for the civil rights movement. And he actually was able to communicate directly with President Johnson when the Civil Rights Title VII work came out. There is, I will really encourage you to read about the story of Longoria. It's called the Longoria Affair. And he actually basically spearheaded the movement of the Longoria Affair to have Mexican Americans more civil rights in the United States. 1986, in the Reagan administration, amnesty came, where it was basically, they gave a lot of amnesty for people that entered the United States before 1986 that worked in the farms. And then in 1996, there was the legislative reform. President Clinton, when they gave everybody a deadline to become citizen, if not, they will lose their Medicare and Medicaid benefits. So this is more or less the Mexican history. Now, if we talk about the Puerto Ricans, Puerto Rico was a U.S. territory since 1898, and they became U.S. citizens in 1917. They started coming to the United States between 48 and 60 because the whole model agriculture industry in the United States was changing to be industrial. So they started coming for work and for economic leverage to the United States. They migrated basically in East Harlem. They worked on a lot of sugar plantations. And they came more or less around the Great Depression and the world, and they situated themselves mostly in East Harlem. That's why the biggest population of Puerto Ricans, you will find them more or less in the East Coast, basically in Harlem. The Cuban Americans.